So what in the world is this guy talking about? Madeirans are Africans? What? He's got to be crazy. But I'm here because I want to hear how he's going to explain this. How is he going to explain this? As far as we know, Madeirans are Portuguese. How can he say we're Africans? Okay, well, stick with me and you will see. And I just want you to know right off the top, this is not a video here to deal with race or anything along that line. So you don't have to panic or get nervous and think I'm going to be talking about color and all that good stuff. It's not going to be anything about that. But just stick with me. Stick with me. In the end, it's going to make sense. Okay? Well, before I get started, let me give you a little background as to why I decided to do this video. And maybe some of you might catch it before, the conclusion of this video, before I even get to the end. But I would still like you to stick with me to show you why I even came up with this somewhat off-the-wall topic that probably no one is really thinking about, but it gives you some food for thought. Okay, first of all, there has been some controversy in the Caribbean community over the past week. Now, for those of you who've been watching, following me on this channel, you know that I am from the Caribbean and that I have ancestral ties to the island of Madeira. So, of course, I keep my pulse on what's going on in Madeira to some extent, and I keep my pulse on what's going on where I'm from, the Caribbean region, even though I don't live in either place. So what's been going on of late is that there's a popular comedian who has risen over the past 10 years, pretty popular in the Caribbean community. He does his comedy using the various accents and dialects of the various Caribbean countries, from Guyana all the way to Jamaica. He will also do little skits with Panamanians, who are also, believe it or not, part of the Caribbean. And he would do some with actually Africans also. But he caused some controversy of late. There was an interview. I don't know the context of the conversation. I just heard where he made the comment. And he said something along the line of, I guess he was asked a question, what should it be called? Curry chicken or chicken curry? Now, this has been a running joke within the Caribbean community, especially between Trinidad and Guyana, two places with large East Indian, people of East Indian heritage. So both places have a large, there's Indo-Trinidadians and there are Indo-Guyanese. So he brought up something, or he was asked a question, and he said something along the line that it should be chicken curry, which would go along the lines of how Trinidadians will call it. And he said the only people that call it chicken curry are Guyanese. So when he said that, that was, again, a running joke going on between those two places, because Guyanese people, they will use it, flip it back and forth, but for the most part, they will call it chicken curry. Trinidadians calling it curry chicken or curry chicken. But he said something after that. After he said only the Guyanese people say chicken curry, he said they say chicken curry and they're not even a part of the Caribbean. That's what he said. They're not a part of the Caribbean. He says we accept them, we love them, but they are not a part of the Caribbean, implying that somehow Guyana is not a part of the Caribbean community. Now, the comment made no sense because when he is doing his skits, he always, or he pretty often, includes the Guyanese people as a part of his skits. Now, he says he represents the Caribbean, and he does his jokes about the Caribbean and the Caribbean peoples, various islands, various countries. So he uses the Guyanese in his skits as basically a part of the Caribbean community. Excuse me, the lights just went off. Okay, there they are. So he's using the Guyanese in his skits, which basically implies that he sees them as a part of the Caribbean community. But then, in this comment, he goes on and says, oh, by the way, they're not a part of the Caribbean anyway. Now, some people jumped to his defense. He got the whole Guyanese community upset. And why some people came to his defense is because Guyana is technically a country that sits on the South American continent. It's a part of South America. Physically, it's a part of South America. But in terms of its culture, in terms of who it's most associated with, economically, historically, socially, they're more associated with the rest of the actual Caribbean region, or the English-speaking Caribbean, than they are with the rest of South America where they are. Guyana is the only English-speaking country on the continent of South America. The Guyanese people, or Guyana in general, has more in common with, say, St. Kitts, or the British Virgin Islands, or St. Vincent or St. Lucia, than it does with Uruguay, or Argentina, or Chile. And those countries that I just mentioned are all part of South America, just like Guyana. The Guyanese people do not speak Spanish, whereby much of South America speaks Spanish. Of course, there's Portuguese in Brazil, so it'll be the most populous language there, because I think Brazil has a population greater than the rest of South America combined. I could be wrong about that. But Portuguese or Spanish are the primary languages on the continent of South America. Guyana, on the other hand, they speak English. A Guyanese cannot just drop in the middle of Paraguay and kind of relate. You understand? First of all, there's the language barrier. They don't really make the same foods. They don't listen to the same music. But a Guyanese can land in St. Thomas, where I'm from, can land in Trinidad and Barbados and fit right on in, because the culture there is familiar to them, because that's pretty much the kind of culture they have back home in their country. They listen to the same music, pretty much are familiar with the same foods. And you have to understand that back in colonial times, Guyana was a part of the British West Indies. So England had these colonies in the Caribbean, and by virtue of having these colonies, they sort of lumped them all together and spread their influence across all of these colonies that they had, Guyana being one of them. So the British, they were in Antigua, for example. They were in Trinidad. They were in St. Lucia. These were all places where they had their influence. And in terms of having their influence there, ooh, sorry about that. Let me stop that. Okay. Sorry about that. My earphones went off from my ear. They're so sensitive. But anyway, they had all of these islands under their control or part of their possessions. And so they spread their influence from island to island, from country to country, all the way down to South America, which, of course, their colony there was Guyana, or British Guyana back in the days when it was under the British flag. So by lumping all of these places together, the British moved between these various colonies that they had, and people from these various colonies moved from one to the next. You had a lot of people from the island of Barbados that went to Guyana. You had a lot of people from Guyana that went to Barbados. You had a lot of people from St. Lucia that was under the British flag that went to Guyana. People from Guyana went to Trinidad. People from Trinidad went to Guyana, and so on. So Guyana has always pretty much been, ever since colonial times, been associated with the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean that was under the British flag. So Guyana is seen as a part, not physically, is seen as a part of the Caribbean community, even though their country is physically on the South American continent. So when I look at the word Caribbean, I, for one, can hold a narrow definition of it, which would be the islands of the Caribbean chain, starting from Cuba or even the Bahamas, all the way down to the island of Trinidad, the Caribbean chain of islands. And you would say, that's the Caribbean. That's generally the understanding a lot of people have of the Caribbean. But the Caribbean can also have a wider definition. And when you include the wider definition, you would say something like a country like Belize, which is in Central America, has a coastline along the Caribbean Sea, which means that it would be a part of the Caribbean because it actually sits on the Caribbean Sea. The same can go for Honduras, for Nicaragua, for Panama, for Costa Rica, for even Guatemala, and even Mexico, which all have a Caribbean coastline, because all those countries I mentioned have a coastline on the Caribbean Sea. And this also includes Venezuela and Colombia. So all of those countries can technically be called a part of the Caribbean because they're a part of the Caribbean. They have a shoreline along the Caribbean Sea. But most of those places I mentioned, most people don't think of those places as part of the Caribbean. But if we want to get technical, and we're going to use the definition that a Caribbean location, a place to be considered the Caribbean, must have a Caribbean Sea coastline, well, those countries have a Caribbean Sea coastline, and they can be considered the Caribbean. But then it gets more interesting, because you can also talk about the fact that some countries don't have a Caribbean Sea coastline, a country like Barbados. Sorry about that. Okay, well, maybe it should stay like that. So you have a country like Barbados that does not have a Caribbean Sea coastline. Barbados lies entirely in the Atlantic Ocean. Get some light in here. Okay. So Barbados lies entirely in the Atlantic Ocean. So it doesn't have a Caribbean Sea coastline. But one thing about Barbados is that Barbados sits on the Caribbean plate. Now you may ask, what is a plate? There are things below the ocean. There are land masses below the ocean that if you remove the ocean away and you looked at Barbados, you will notice that beneath the earth there are things they call tectonic plates. That's the landmass that sits on the ocean floor. Now, some of that ocean floor over the ages protruded up out of the ocean through seismic and earth and volcanic activity that pushed that landmass up, and it came above the water, and they became islands. Barbados happens to be one of those type of places where it either pushed up from under the ocean through seismic and volcanic activity, or another thing that can happen, some places had glaciers covered over with ice, and as the ice melted or the waters receded, it basically exposed land, depending on where it is in the world. So Barbados doesn't have a Caribbean coastline, but it sits on the tectonic plate known as the Caribbean plate. And it gets more interesting because you have Cuba. So if you have the Caribbean plate, and I don't have any pictures right now to show you, but if you look at a picture of the Caribbean plate pretty much stretches from down around Trinidad. If you follow in the Caribbean, and it looks like an arc like this. So the Caribbean plates, and say Trinidad is down here and Cuba is up here. So the Caribbean plate sort of goes around the entire Caribbean Sea, comes right around Trinidad, encompasses Barbados over here, and it goes around this way and it comes back around towards Cuba. But when it gets to Cuba, it dips. Now, if this is Cuba, it dips onto Cuba right there. And all of this on the other side is known as the North American plate. But the Caribbean plate comes up and dips onto Cuba and goes around this way back down towards places like Costa Rica. So the interesting thing is, Cuba is not a part of the Caribbean plate. It's not a part of the tectonic plate or the landmass that you would consider as the Caribbean plate. Cuba is actually a part of the North American plate. But there's another definition that makes Cuba part of the Caribbean, because it's against the Caribbean Sea. It has a coastline on the Caribbean Sea, even though physically and geologically it is not sitting on the Caribbean plate. So Caribbean can have different definitions, and in Guyana's case, it is a part of the Caribbean community in terms of the fact that it is associated with the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean. It has been associated with the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean since the early 1800s. And it is always kind of participating in things that the other Caribbean islands do, English-speaking Caribbean islands. When there's a carnival involving the English-speaking Caribbean, whether they be Jamaicans, Antiguans, people from St. Kitts, people from St. Lucia, Grenada, you can find Guyanese people in the mix. Okay? And it's quite interesting because you will find Guyana there, but in some cases you won't find Puerto Ricans or Dominicans because they have their own thing going on. So the bottom line is, Guyana has always been, at least since the British took over in 1815, associated with the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean. So they are like brothers and sisters as part of this community, even though they are on another continent in South America. And when you think about where they're located in South America, relatively speaking, they are not that far away from the Caribbean chain. I think it's about an hour and 45-minute flight from Guyana to Trinidad, the closest Caribbean island to it. So a Guyanese can be in Trinidad in less than 2 hours, and vice versa. So now, where does this come in with Madeira now? Well, when it comes to Madeira, the reason why this is even a video right now is because I use Madeira as an example of the situation with Guyana. Because I was actually mentioning it to quite a bit of Guyanese people who have roots or have ancestry back to Madeira, it was somewhat relevant for me to use Madeira as an example to prove the point about Guyana. Here's the thing. Madeira, if you ask any Madeiran, if you ask any European, Madeirans, what are they? Say, Portuguese. They are absolutely 100% right. Madeirans are Portuguese by citizenship. So if you want to go that route, they're perfectly right. Perfectly right. Madeirans are Portuguese by citizenship. But if you're talking about Madeira, the island, and where it is situated in the world, Madeira is actually not a part of Europe, physically and geologically speaking, in terms of the Earth. The landmass that is not entirely exposed, well, it's exposed, but the area where Madeira is at, the land beneath Madeira, or where Madeira sprung up from, Madeira sprung up from the African plate. So the same continent of Africa that you can see, that is above the water, there's parts of Africa, like every other continent, that is also submerged under the water. So when we see the continent, if you had to jump off, say, Liberia or Morocco and jump into the water, and you could dive all the way down, you will notice that there's land area down there in the ocean floor that is attached to the continent of Africa. That is a part of the continent of Africa. And the way that scientists or geologists work on this or show it is that, remember I mentioned plates. So the earth is like a cracked egg. And so those lines that separate each crack, those lines are called fault lines. So you have the African plate like this, that basically the entire exposed continent of Africa sits on. But there's land that is submerged under the water that extends out into the ocean. So the African plate just doesn't end with Africa and that's it. No, the African plate goes offshore also, all the way around. And this is why you have places like Madagascar, which is not attached to the continent of Africa, the mainland. It's actually offshore, or Mauritius. But both of those islands are considered part of Africa. And they're considered part of Africa because they sit on the African plate, except that they're elevated above the ocean. That's on the southeastern side of the African continent that we can see, offshore. But again, they're part of the African plate that is submerged under the water, that the actual physical continent of Africa that we can see that is above the water is also a part of. So now on the northwestern side where Madeira sits, off the coast of Morocco, Madeira itself is also a part of that same African plate. And so are the Azores, for the most part. The Azores are a little bit more interesting because they straddle. Remember I talked about that fault line where the crack is and there's a line between each crack? So right above the African plate is the Eurasian plate, which is where Europe is at. It spreads all the way over towards Europe. And that's the Eurasian plate. Madeira is not a part of that plate. Madeira is a part of the African plate. The Canary Islands are part of the African plate. Cabo Verde is a part of the African plate. Sao Tome and Principe are part of the African plate. Understand? So Madeira physically sits as part of the African continent. And how you can actually prove this even more? If you drained all the water around, all around Africa, you will look and you will see the African continent elevated above. Then you see it dip down, but the land is still connected. And you see it spread out. And then you will get up to Madeira, and you'll see Madeira is a part of that same plate, that same landmass. And then as you go right above Madeira, you will see a crack, a fault line. And usually those fault lines, it's very deep there. The water is very deep because now it cascades over because it drops down into this dividing line, this fault line or this trench. It falls down into that. And then on the other side of that, you start Europe, or you start the Eurasian plate. And the Azores a little further up, they sort of straddle the fault line between the two. So places like São Miguel in the Azores, part of it, the south side, is over on the African plate, and the other side of it is over in the Eurasian plate. And where you have fault lines, you tend to have earthquakes. Where you have fault lines, you tend to have volcanoes. And this explains why the Great Lisbon earthquake was so powerful, because the earthquake actually happened offshore, right where those two plates sit. And what happens? They rub against one another. They're moving, fraction of an inch, but they're moving. And when they touch and they grate against one another, all that energy fires off in the form of an earthquake. So, talking about the topic of this video, this is why I say that Madeirans are Africans. Not because that's their citizenship. They're not citizens of any African country. By citizenship, they are associated with Portugal. They're Europeans by citizenship. But their physical location, if they're born there, where they're from, where they live, they actually live on a piece of land that is actually a part of Africa. Now, does it make sense? So, I know some people might be like, well, what are you talking about? No. So, you have to understand this. When it comes to these type of things, it can be rather fluid. In the case of Guyana, they're part of the South American continent. And while Guyanese will say, yeah, we're South Americans, they don't really, that's not the first identifying mark that they use. You say a Guyanese, they will say, yeah, we're part of the Caribbean community. We're Caribbean. We're Caribbean folks. That's their first identifier for most of them. And then second, on a secondary level, yeah, we're South Americans. Over in Madeira, it's the other way around. Even though, they don't look at it as deeply as I'm looking at Guyana and the Caribbean. But their first identifier would be, we're Europeans by citizenship. We're part of Portugal. We're Europeans as the first identifier. Most Madeirans, sure the majority of them are not sitting back there thinking, yeah, we're also Africans. Not thinking that. First identifier, Portuguese. They might have a second identifier, I really don't know. But this, by mentioning this, if you want to talk about where they're actually from, where their land actually is, it's actually a part of Africa. Part of the African plate, if you want to call it that. Part of the African tectonic plate. A little something similar happens with us as Virgin Islanders. We are U.S. citizens. And again, remember I told you about how fluid this thing can be. We are U.S. citizens. We are born U.S. citizens in the U.S. Virgin Islands because our islands were purchased by the United States in 1917, and the citizenship of the people living there was transferred from Denmark because Denmark occupied or owned the islands prior to the United States buying them. We went from Danish citizens to American citizens. So everyone, including myself, born there since 1917, are American citizens. But where we are, our islands are firmly in the middle of the Caribbean, in the middle of the ocean. As a matter of fact, our islands are not even a part of the North American plate where the United States is, even though it straddles. Our islands are in the Caribbean region, in the Caribbean Sea, on the Caribbean plate, but we're American citizens. But if you ask the average Virgin Islander, how do you associate yourself? What are you? Oh, I'm from the Caribbean. We don't say I'm from America, even though we're American citizens. Our nationality, Americans. But that's secondary to us. Our first identifier, we're from the Caribbean. So you see how fluid it can be? Guyana, first identifier, we're part of the Caribbean. Yeah, we're South Americans. Yeah, that's where our country is, but we're part of the Caribbean. Madeirans, of course, I'm putting this out there now, so maybe it may become a conversation. But it's not a conversation like how it is probably in the Virgin Islands and in Guyana. But now it's going to probably be a part of that conversation because I've put it out there. Where it's like, we're Portuguese. First identifier. But hey, you know what? There's this guy on YouTube that says our land, our island is actually a part of Africa. So are we Africans? Are we Africans by terms of where our island sits? It's a part of Africa? Yeah. Now, of course, I don't think Madeira's going to be running around the place saying, we're Africans. We're Africans. But notice, going a little further, down the street from Madeira, you have the Cape Verde Islands. At one point, they were part of Portugal. They were Portuguese citizens. And if you probably went down there and said, hey, what are you guys? We're Portuguese. Even though their islands are hundreds and hundreds of miles away from mainland Portugal. Today, they're an independent country. You ask them today, what are you? Oh, we're Africans. Yeah, our island is a part of the African continent. So you see how it goes, see how it gets pretty fluid? At one point, they were Portuguese via citizenship. Maybe they had a second identifier as being Africans. But now the primary identification is we are Africans. But we used to be under the Portuguese flag. We once upon a time were Portuguese citizens. Sure, the Canary Islands can go ahead and be in the same position, just like Madeira. The Canary Islands are part of Africa also. But the citizens are Spaniards. So now, I know what I said might have sounded controversial. A topic may seem controversial. Got your attention, brought you here. And hopefully you stayed all the way to the end to understand what I was getting at. So it has nothing to do with race here. I'm not talking about anybody's color and all of that and whatever. I don't know if there may be some Madeirans who are watching this video who might be offended or whatever because maybe they don't want to be identified as being, you know, same sentence as Africans. I really don't know. I'm just, you know, I have no idea. But it's food for thought, right? I hope it is. And it's something to think about. So when you think about culture, you think about citizenship, you think about geography, you think about geology, identifications can somewhat be rather fluid. And if I had to give one last illustration, let's pick a country like Algeria. First thought that comes to a lot of people's minds, if they know where Algeria is, think of Algeria, yeah, it's in Africa, but for most people you think of it as being a part of the Arab world. The Muslim world. And the Muslim world is not exactly spread down into sub-Saharan Africa, even though there are pockets of, you know, Muslim areas. The Muslim world spreads more towards the northeast, towards Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, other places over there, Yemen, Qatar, the UAE. So when you think about Algeria, it has more in common with other countries in the Arab world over in Asia than it does with other countries on its own continent. Algeria has more in common with, let's just say, has more in common with Syria than it does with Lesotho in South Africa, even though they share the same continent. So again, you could just see the fluidity of how you can use these types of things. So I've spoken about Guyana, I've spoken about Madeira, I've spoken about the Virgin Islands, I've spoken about Algeria, giving you illustrations of how these things can just be so fluid and move around and so forth. But the reason why I chose Madeira in an illustration was to show how you can have people living in one place but being identified with another place. In Guyana, they're on the South American continent, but they identify with the rest of the Caribbean. In Madeira, their landmass is on the African continent, but via their citizenship and their long history, going back all the way to 1419, they have been associated with Portugal, even though Portugal is on a different landmass. Okay? Anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, okay? I thought it was rather interesting. And there was no malicious intent here, nothing about race. I don't know if people are going to get all frustrated, flustered, bothered, angered, be like, hey, I never thought about that. I have no idea. But I just figured I'll just share it with you guys, okay? Tell me what you think in the comments. You can like this video, you can share it, and I'm sure it's going to be one of those videos people are going to be clicking through and like, let me look at the video on Madeira and look around and like, Madeirans are African. What? Let me go back to that video. So I'm probably going to get that. But I want to thank you guys for tuning in to another video here on Mad About Madeira. Let me get back down to my office since I was sitting up here hanging out. It was pouring rain out there a while ago, but it's eased up now. But again, I want to thank you so much for tuning in, okay? I really appreciate it. I would love to hear what you have to say down in the comment section. Take care until we talk again.